So our group's research proposal is the effects of PBIS on minority students. This is by Ashanti McLean, myself, Sylvia Hauser, and Patricia Diaz. Abstract. Let me just scoot this over. Sorry. Abstract. The purpose of the study is to determine if positive behavioral interventions and supports reduce the suspension rates in schools for minority students in the United States. Several reports across the county have stated that African American and Hispanic students are being suspended or expelled at a disproportionate rate compared to their subgroups. The focus is to determine if the strategies used in PBIS reduce the suspension rates for minority students. These strategies consist of creating and sustaining primary and secondary systems of support that improve the overall well-being of each student. It includes personal health, social, family, work, and recreation for all students, not just the behaviors they exhibit at school. PBIS targets the less effective, efficient, and relevant behaviors while focusing on the positive behaviors. This study applied the quantitative method and gathered information from schools across the county, literature reviews, articles, books, and online resources that addressed PBIS and the reduction of suspension rates for minority students. The research question for this study is, does PBIS affect the suspension rates for minority students in urban settings when compared to other student subgroups? Data was collected from several different scholarly resources, which gave a vast amount of data on PBIS. However, could not produce much data on whether PBIS reduced the suspension rates for minority students. Further research is needed on this topic to get a full understanding as to whether or not PBIS is working to reduce the suspension rates of minority students. Our introduction. African American students are being suspended at a disproportionate rate across the United States. According to the federal data from the Department of Education, this subgroup is nearly 4 times as likely to get suspended than their white classmates. Many schools across the country have started to implement positive behavior interventions and PBIS to deal with the high suspension rates. Positive behavior interventions and supports, which is PBIS, is a 3-tiered framework that combines data systems and practices that affect student behavioral outcomes. Research on PBIS implementation in schools have shown that implementation with fidelity can improve student behavior as well as reduce office discipline referrals and out-of-school suspensions. Despite the multiple studies that have addressed the impact of PBIS on students in general, very little research has been conducted that looked at how PBIS affects African American students or students of color specifically. This slide is our problem statement, purpose of study, and research question. The problem statement: minority students across the country are being suspended at a disproportionate rate compared to other subgroups. Students who are given an out-of-school suspension are more likely to lose valuable instructional time and fall behind in their classes. In 2016, nearly 24% of Black students in the U.S. elementary and secondary schools have been suspended at least one time. As our new analysis of the National Household Education Survey shows, by contrast, only 1/3 as many white students, which is 8%, and only 1/6 as many Asian students, 4%, have been suspended. This is a stark reminder of how much our education system has to improve, and many school districts have adopted PBIS to solve this issue and reduce suspension rates. The specific problem addressed in this qualitative study is the high suspension rates of minority students and the effects PBIS has on the reduction of these suspensions. The purpose of the study. The purpose of this study is to use quantitative data to analyze the effects PBIS has on suspension rates for minority students. By examining the data from several different resources, we can get a full understanding as to whether the implementation of PBIS reduces the suspension rates of minority students. This study will compare the suspension rates prior to implementation and after implementation. The ultimate purpose is to determine if PBIS is a significant tool to reduce the suspension rates of minority students. Our research question is, does PBIS affect the suspension rates for minority students in urban school settings when compared to other subgroups?
Okay, the literature review key points. Go over PBIS and office discipline referrals. Aboriginal Canadian students showed decreases in ODRs after PBIS implementation, and public under-resourced schools showed continuous decreases in ODRs over 3 years of PBIS implementation. PBIS and suspensions, schools which implemented school-wide PBIS had fewer suspensions than those who did not. PBIS and African-American students were less likely to receive out-of-school suspensions at schools that implemented school-wide PBIS. And out-of-school suspension rates were reduced in schools across the US that implemented PBIS frameworks. Methodology and setting. This study will use a mixed methods approach, qualitative and quantitative, in order to collect data. This study will use both qualitative and quantitative sources of data from across the country. The purpose of this is to gather enough information to truly determine the implications of PBIS on suspension rates, particularly for minority students. The setting for this study, we will gather data from various middle schools and high schools throughout the country. Discipline data will be collected directly from the school districts. Participants and data instruments. Our participants will be students from local high schools and middle schools. And our data instruments will be, we will collect self-collected student intervention data from schools, data from the California dashboard, and interviews. And our references.
All right, so that is our presentation on the implementation of PBIS for minority students.